Greetings. My name is Ryan, and I am an atheist for humanity. If you've stumbled across this video on YouTube, then know that I'm making it for my Tumblr, which I've been on for about 2 years now. A while ago, I asked my followers if I made a video, what would they like to see? And the first response I got was how I became an atheist. So here I am to tell you how I became an atheist. In this video, I'm going to cover 4 broad topics. The first is going to be my experience going to church as a kid. The second will be my experience with spirituality as an adult. The third will be my questioning my concept of God and those beliefs. And the fourth will be becoming an atheist. So I'm going to cover those briefly and try and stay short and to the point for my first video. So here we go. Okay, topic 1. My experience going to church as a child. When I was around 10 years old, the Mormon missionaries came to my home and started talking to my father. He quickly started attending the church, and that became my church as a child. It was the only one that I ever went to. The first thing that I want to get out of the way is that I did not have a harmful or abusive experience as a child at church. That's not where this is going. So let's just be clear about that. But what I do want to talk about is something that I realized in reflection later on. And that is that I was lied to by the adults at church. And what I mean by that is that I was presented things as if they were facts when they actually are not facts. What I'm talking about is everything from the Adam and Eve story all the way to Jesus being a demigod, and in the Mormon theology, the existence of ancient civilizations that predated Native Americans. All of those things were packaged and presented as if they were absolute facts. And I often had experiences where authorities at church would tell me that they know what God thinks or his opinions on things or how things work in heaven. And reflecting back later on after I had left the church, which was actually at 13, I realized that none of these things were actual facts, and they are either in dispute or disproven or cannot be known. So to present them to a child as if they were absolute facts is dishonest. And so what was happening was that the authority figures and adults in my life were using their power of authority and the trust I had in them to make me believe in these things. And the reason that that is significant is that even though I left the church as a teenager for my own reasons, when I reflected back later, I could never go back to being religious. Because one, I knew that these things were not true, and they were presented to me in such a dishonest way that I was very aware of the tactics that religion uses to make people believe, and they have nothing to do with evidence or factualness, so I can never go back to being religious. Although I did continue under the assumption that God was a real thing, and that's important. Another realization I didn't have about that experience until recently as a future educator, I realized that dogma and faith-based thinking ruin critical thinking. Real quick, here's the problem. If you present an idea and you declare that it doesn't need evidence, then you create a caveat in the brain where the person accepts that proof is not a requirement for belief. Compare this to someone who will only believe what can be proven. The second person is far less likely to believe in falsehoods and extremist ideas, whereas the first person can potentially believe in anything, including dangerous falsehoods and extremist ideas. This is dangerous for both the person and society. So, to move on to my next 2 topics, spirituality as an adult and questioning my beliefs. To tell you this part of my story, I have to reveal that I am in recovery. I was caught in the grips of drug addiction as a teenager and entered recovery in the 12-step programs. The first thing I want to get out of the way is that I owe my life to the 12 steps, and I will always be grateful for that. However, when it comes to my experience with God and concepts of spirituality, I can no longer support the things that I used to believe. Before I continue, I just want to give a small disclaimer that I am not speaking for any 12-step fellowship and should not be considered a representative in any way, shape, or form. So, coming to believe. Remember that I had came into this process already assuming the existence of God, because like so many other people, I just accepted that God existed because the idea is so ubiquitous in our society. I never thought that God might not exist. In recovery, you're encouraged to create your own concept of a higher power. And the reason for this is so that no one is forced to believe in any one thing, like in religion. Everyone is free to have their own ideas. That works for a lot of people because they don't feel constrained. So, what this actually means, and this process will be surprising to my followers, is that you take some personal time to think about what you would want God to be like, what you think God might be like, and you really impose positive characteristics on that figure and create an image that you can accept and that gives you strength. So the concept that I came up with after taking the suggestions was really a bare bones concept, and that is that God is all powerful, God is all loving, and God wants good things for me. This purposely leaves out many specifics as to not have to justify why you think God is exactly like this or exactly like that. It's just very general ideas about what God might be like. And the idea is that it's supposed to work for you. So that was the formation of my sense of spirituality. And from there, it progressed into a very kind of typical sense of spirituality where I felt that I drew personal strength from my higher power, and occasionally that my higher power intervened and helped me accomplish things in life in various ways. And that's the part that gets interesting. So it was the question of how involved is God in my life that really got me started on my path to non belief. About 5 years into recovery, this question was bothering me. I was constantly wondering, well, what does God do? Does he come down and actually manipulate the world to create favorable circumstances for me? What's happening? I wanted to know for the first time what the mechanics were. So I sat down with a friend over coffee and we had a long conversation about this. And after the conversation, I came to two conclusions. One was that there is no proof whatsoever that a God interacts with this world in any way, and I could no longer ignore that. Second is that it didn't make sense for me to believe that an ultimate power was taking the time to do things like help me get a job or put people in my life or manipulate circumstances to benefit me, when clearly he wasn't intervening in war, famine, slavery, child abuse. All these horrible things in the world are going unchecked. And yet I believe that God's helping me have dinner. It just didn't make any sense. And I couldn't defend the idea anymore. So from that point, I stopped believing that God did anything to interact with this world. And that question of whether God interacts with this world is directly related to something called the question of evil. Now, I won't lay that out here, but you can Google it and easily get a syllogism of that argument, and it's very powerful. No apologist has been able to give a satisfactory answer to that question yet. And it basically asks, why don't we see interaction from God? Now, from here, I went on believing that God still existed, but that he did not interact with the world. So here I am, years into recovery. I rejected religion very early in my life. I adopted spirituality, but I've now whittled that down only to the belief that a God exists. I'm still just assuming that, but it's really only downhill from here because I've already started this path of requiring evidence for belief, like I talked about earlier. And a few years later, after continuing this kind of middle ground, it hit me that not only can I not support the idea that God interacts with the world, I really can't support the idea that a God exists because I just don't have the evidence. There's nothing there. There's no reason for me to think that there's an all-powerful being beyond this world. If I concluded, as I did earlier, that there's no evidence of its interaction with the world, then what evidence do I have that it exists? If I cannot see it, hear it, see its effects, or measure it in any way, then for all intents and purposes, it does not exist. So from there was nothing left to do but take on the label atheist. Now, let's be clear. Atheist is just a word that means a person who is not convinced that gods exist. And that was me. I was no longer convinced that gods exist. So therefore, I became an atheist. And I realized that this really came from my personal growth, where I was no longer willing to profess or accept ideas that could not be proven. And that came from a love of philosophy and science. And I took those principles and started applying them to all areas of my life. And anything that could not be definitely proven, I gave up. As some people have said, I started to desire to believe as many true things as possible and to not believe as many falsehoods as possible. I wish I had something more dramatic or entertaining to tell you, but it really came down to just prioritizing evidence, becoming a more skeptical person, and most of all, being more honest with myself, to stop diluting myself into accepting things when I knew that strictly they couldn't be justified. And once I started doing all of those things, a lot of beliefs that I used to have started falling away. And I became more committed to reality. So that is my process. I want to thank everyone for listening. Please do visit my Tumblr page and check out articles I've written on belief and faith and religion and politics as well. If you have questions or comments, leave them below. If you want to get on Tumblr and send me some hate mail, please do that as well. Again, my name is Ryan, and I am an atheist for humanity. Thank you for watching.